name's Mark Edmondson, and we've just finished this cherry bench for an article on fine woodworking. Now that we've finished with the warp strands, it's time to start the last phase of the weave. And we'll be beginning by tacking into a pre-drilled hole in the back leg and working our way across the bench, going over and under the warp strands and hooking on the Danish L nails, working our way towards the front of the bench. To simplify glue up, it's often necessary to remove this first nail to keep the nails from hitting each other. And so now's the time to replace that nail. What we'll do now is take our line, and into our pre-drill hole we'll tack the start of the weave. Thread the cut tack through the strands, making sure not to cut the strand. Start it in the pre-drilled hole. With the pigtail, just bring it below the row of nails. Up and over the top. Start feeding the strand through. Don't worry about tension yet. Okay, at this point you want to pull a little bit of slack out and bring the line so that it's right up to the edge of the weave support rail. And you're not pulling real tight. If you pull too tight, you're going to cause the warp strands to go up and over. We want kind of a halfway point where this first strand is doing this motion over under, but not too tight that it's straight, but not too loose that it's floppy. So bring the cord around and hook it on the first nail. Work your slack back out. Go to the beginning of the strand, pull your slack out, and then just bring it in close to the first. Our next strand is going to lock that back. So that's why we start in the back, is because the first weave is a little loose. So by starting in the back, we guarantee that the front weave strand will be fairly tight. Now the tension on this second weave needs to be a lot greater. As you work your way in more weave strands, you'll have it'll be easier to keep the weave from trying to work back out into the field, because they'll just lock right in. Okay, pull the bite through and work the slack out, bringing the strand up against the previous one. You want it to be tight. This is not overly tight, but it's definitely a pretty good tug. Making sure that it's straight. You can see it's starting to lock the strands in place. And around, go to a new nail. You'll know that you're pulling too tight if the weave keeps wanting to go back on the field. If it doesn't lock in, then that means you've got too much tension. So you can kind of use that as a gauge. As you start to get, into the middle of the bench, you want to check, make sure that your weave is straight. So just kind of sight down the end. And you also want to make sure that there's no gaps in between the strands here, that you're trying to pull this as tight as you can. That will pay off when we get to the end. As we get towards the end of the weave, it's going to be a lot slower feeding the line. And in fact, you may want to feed out a bite like that and work your way in little segments. It's not as hard to keep the tension in the line anymore, so You don't necessarily need to hold this tight and to get the lines to pull in at the right tension. It's just stiff enough now between the warp strands to keep it from losing its tautness. Okay, just about done. On the second to last strand, and the weaving is a lot slower now. Go ahead and pull enough to get across the bench and enough to know that you'll make it over. Okay, you might need to use something to help you get that out. There we go. Okay, now work your way back. Okay, so that's the last weave. Go ahead and give yourself plenty. We finished the weave and we flipped the bench upside down on some sawhorses with some carpet on it, and we're going to tack off the very last strand, tuck our pigtails, and pound our L nails the rest of the way in. The last thing to do after finishing the weave is to make sure that the warp strands are running relatively straight. And for that I use just a scrap of wood and a smaller one with the ends just softened with a file. And place the straight edge just along and kind of work your way down, pushing on the warp strands, and so that they run parallel to the block of wood. You want to do this as soon after the weave as you can. If you wait too long, the cord gets kind of a memory to it, and it's harder to get it to go back to straight. So take the time as soon as you're done weaving to make sure that it's running nice and parallel. A little variation is not a problem, but you just want to make sure there's nothing that is really out of whack.